Um, Let me first introduce myself. I'm Ellany Kayce. I'm an enrolled tribal member of the Tlingit Nation. I'm Raven Frog Clan, born and raised in Seattle. My people are from Southeast Alaska. And I'm the board chair of the Nakani Native Program, which is a 501c3 in Seattle. And then I have my colleague here, Jonathan Betzall, if you'd like to introduce yourself, Jonathan.
Sure. My name is Jonathan Betzall. My pronouns are he, him. I'm Ashkenazi Jewish background, and I've been a Quaker for 50 years, and which got me in contact with Ellany and Jeff Smith of the Nakani Native Program. So I am Secretary Treasurer of that group, and I will be your host tonight, kind of running things mostly behind the scenes. Just so everyone knows, we are recording this session so that we can have a record of all the information that was presented, and hopefully we'll be able to put it on our website.
Great. Yes, and let me just say a couple of things. We have a lot to cover this evening, and I do have an agenda. And what's preferably is if there's questions you have, it would be encouraged for you to jot them down, because there will be a section for Q&A at the end. But we also are going to break out into small groups near the end, and you'll see why. And once we go through the material, you'll kind of see why I'm kind of doing it in the order that I'm doing it. I created this curriculum a few years back, and it keeps evolving and changing, and it's a modularized training so that I add or delete things that are appropriate to whatever group I'm giving the workshop to. So I've been doing this for a long time. I'm a trainer and a facilitator. And I've been working in and out of the Native community for over 45 years. So let me just get started. It's called Building Bridges Between Cultures. And the workshop is to help you learn how to be an ally to Indigenous people and also learn about some of our cultures and history. And so I just want to identify that first we are on the Duwamish territory, which is Seattle, King County, and also Duwamish and Suquamish. And then just to the south of Seattle, we have the Muckleshoot, and who are actually related. The Muckleshoot, the Suquamish, and Duwamish are actually all related. And then the Tulalip are just north of Seattle. And we have a map, which we'll go over later in the presentation. And Jonathan, do you want to show the slide, the first slide briefly, and then the second slide? There we go. That's the title page. It shows that we have an office in the U District area. And then that's our brief agenda. So after the agenda, then we go into the Nakani Native Program is led by Native people. And we recognize that there's a deep cultural conflict that exists between mainstream society and Native Americans. And consequently, that's why we exist. We do advocacy for equity and social justice so that we can enhance our lives and build our resilience and contribute to the survival of all people. And Nakani is actually a Tlingit word that means go-between. So a person serves a go-between as a connection between different peoples and cultures. And that's what the workshop is about. Next slide. And then one of the things, besides building bridges, we also advocate for tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. So we monitor current struggles and we inform the public on how they can support Indigenous people's interests. And there's a lot more detail on that on our website about that. We also support the tribal canoe journey. And the tribal canoe journey is very culturally important. It's revitalizing our languages, our salmon ceremonies, our songs, our reconnecting to our water, our land, our relatives. And it's all critical in our healing from the colonial systems of oppression. Next slide. And we also have a very special relationship with Healthier Here. It's a Medicaid transformation program where we've been distributing traditional plant foods and medicines to indigenous people here in the urban setting. And one of the many things that we've done is procure someone to actually create tribal face masks by tribal people from the Makah and the Warm Springs people on their reservations. Next slide. And that's a picture of our board. Okay, next slide. Now, very briefly, these are the group agreements for our workshop tonight. We want to treat each other with respect and dignity. No one is disposable. We all come from different backgrounds and abilities and identities and experiences. We know that the unequal systems do exist, so we're not here to argue the existence of white privilege, racism, patriarchy, classism, colonialization, and other forms of oppression. We're here tonight to work together to ensure that we're not replicating these systems, the very systems we're trying to fight. And then also everyone is capable of doing harm and being harmed. So we want to allow space for compassion with each other. And I really welcome you to make mistakes about my group. And also because that's how we learn. And then we would just hold each other accountable and meet each other wherever we're at. So we'll go to the next slide. And then we want to be intentional. So we want to contribute to the space in a good way so that, you know, be gender inclusive, be mindful of speaking for I and not assuming the we. And then move up and move back just means that everyone is invited to participate, to be present and contribute to the discussion. So those who tend to talk a lot, we want you to take the time to actively listen more. And if you tend to listen a lot, we want you to really add your voice. So that's like the stepping up and stepping back. And then just encourage to use limit jargon and just explain terms so that everyone's kind of on the same page. Next slide. And then we want to take care of our needs. In other words, be flexible. So if the agenda makes any shifts, we want to adjust for that, and also honor yourself and each other in this work that we're doing. And then also we want to expect a lack of closure. We're not going to be able to solve all the world's problems tonight in these 2 hours. And so this is just the beginning of the conversations. It cannot end here and it must continue. So thank you. Gunashtish is a Tlingit word that means Gunashtish. No, go to the, and just want to show if everyone is in agreement of these group agreements, that would be great to see a show of hands. Great, excellent, thank you. Okay, so we'll go into the, I kind of briefly wanted to go through that so we can get into the meat of the workshop. So this is a systematic cycle of oppression, and this was actually created by Dr. Robin DiAngelo, and she and I worked together at the City of Seattle a few years ago, and she and I created a workshop together, and she's given me permission to utilize this slide. And I like to read the slide from left corner to going to the right clockwise. So there is a systematic mistreatment of targeted groups. And as you know, the targeted groups are, we call them, the current term is BIPOC, so it's Blacks, Indigenous, and people of color. And those are the targeted groups. And then it moves to around the circle. We justify the further mistreatment of the oppression based on the effects of having been oppressed. And then we go to the next part is institutions perpetuate and enforce that. For example, the police department is an institution that perpetuates and enforces the oppression, as what's been happening currently with killing Black people even in their back, and they're not even doing anything wrong. The next one is internalized dominance, which is the feeling superior, often unconsciously, towards the target group, and that's from the group that feels that they are, that's the dominant group that has the internalized dominance. Internalized oppression, which is the next going around the circle, is the belief that the misinformation about your own group. So what happens by the third grade, all of us have learned these systematic cycles of oppression. It's actually taught. So when we're born, we are not born bigots or racists, but it's taught to us. and we may not even see it happening, but it's happening. So by the third grade, it's actually in, part of our beingness. And then the next part is society accepts and approves and legitimizes and normalizes the mistreatment through the misinformation, and which is also generated, including no information. So for example, our culture and history has been eliminated from history books very intentionally. When I was going to grade school and junior high and high school, there was literally no information about my people or the Duwamish people here, even though it's the city of Seattle, which is actually named after Chief Seattle. So next slide. So then the definitions, I'll briefly go through these. An ally is a member of the agent or social group who takes a stand against social injustice, which is directed at target groups. And allies make a commitment and an effort to recognize their privilege and works in solidarity with oppressed groups in the struggle for justice. And they understand that it's their responsibility to end forms of oppression. Power is the ability to do something or to act in a particular way, and the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. And then the systematic or institutional power are the ways that a dominant force, the mainstream of the majority, builds oppressive policies into systems and institutions, like in the schools, churches, police, health care systems, etc. Oppression is prejudice plus the systematic or institutional power, so that the systematic targeting or marginalization of one social group by a more powerful group for social, economic, and political benefit. So the oppression can manifest through racism, classism, sexism, heterosexism, etc. And so only the dominant group can be oppressive because they're the only group that has institutionalized power. And that's important to know so that there is no such thing as reverse discrimination, because there's only one group that has the dominant power. Next slide. Racism is prejudice, discrimination directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. So that's race, prejudice plus systematic power equals racism. And then privilege is the ism, like the racism, classism, and sexism, is plus the systematic power of the unearned benefits bestowed upon the mainstream or the dominant groups at the expense of others. That's what privilege is. And then equality and equity are different. Equality is a measure of sameness, where equity is actually the measure of fair treatment, opportunities, and outcomes across race, gender, class, and other dynamics. And it's actually based on it's based on and recognizing the legacy of institutionalized and structural racism, that differing people and communities actually need different resources, which is equity. So in order to be equitable, we provide specific, unique resources that will support groups of people and communities based on what they need in order to reach their full potential. So sameness is not always fairness. So if the oppressed group remains disadvantaged. Next slide. So there's explicit and implicit bias. Explicit is where it's consciously accepting prejudice in favor of or against of one other group with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. So that's explicitly showing favoritism or prejudice. Implicit is consciously rejecting prejudice and stereotypes and supports anti-discrimination efforts, but also holds negative associations unconsciously. So for example, someone who says, Black Lives Matter, but absolutely does nothing to change the systems, or maybe deep down believes that that Black people are the problem. That's just an example. So then race is important to know that that's actually a theory as a specious classification of human beings that assigns human worth and social status using skin color and other visible characteristics for the purpose of establishing and maintaining privilege and power. So race is actually a social and political construct that was invented. And then racial disparities is differences in measurable societal outcomes based on race. So these disparities are rooted in unfairness and injustice and are perpetuated by policies and practices with a racial bias, whether they be implicit or explicit. Okay, next. Okay. Now there's racial equity, which is when social, economic, and political opportunities and outcomes are not predicted based upon a person's race. So that would be more racial equity. Now, racial inequity is when a person's race can predict their social, economic, and political opportunities and outcomes. Racial justice is working to eliminate racial disparities resulting from individual, institutional, and structural racism. Equitable outcomes for all are central to racial justice efforts. And then racial microaggressions, which are also sometimes just called, they can be also macroaggressions or microaggressions. And so that's what that is brief, commonplace, very subtle, or sometimes blatant, daily verbal or behavioral or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. And I can give you a couple of examples. Oh, you don't look Indian. Oh, you don't look Black. Or, they're making comments, or, oh, you're articulate for a whatever the racial group is. Next slide. Now there's structural racism, which is the history and current reality of institutional racism across all institutions. And this is in every institution. And this combines to create a system that negatively impacts communities of color. And I just want to say that when I say communities of color, I mean all groups of color. So it's BIPOCs, Blacks, Indigenous, and all forms of people of color. Now the target groups, which I mentioned earlier, is social identity groups that are disenfranchised, targeted, or exploited. And that could be Blacks, Indigenous, people of color, those that are handicapped, those that are female, or LGBTQ folks. Now white fragility is a state in which a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable. It's triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, tears, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. So for example, white privilege also means a white person can stand up and just walk away, where BIPOCs, people of color, we can't change our skin color. We can't really change our eyes. We might be able to put contacts in, but essentially we can't change our hair. We might be able to straighten it, but our natural hair is also used against certain groups of people. So that's the white privilege, is being able to just get up and walk out, or to argue, or get defensive, or to center themselves in a discussion of with people of color. Next slide. Now, this is really important to also note that there are social inequities and the root causes of health inequities. And the reason why we mention this is because BIPOC people of color have the worst health inequities. And it's based on segregation, income and employment or lack thereof, lack of good education, housing, or there's not affordable housing. A lot of people of color have actually moved out of Seattle because of gentrification, and they can no longer afford. And they also tend to be working in low-income wages and are forced out of Seattle. So that's the gentrification. Transportation is a big issue. Air quality. Majority of all the pollutants are happening in and around reservations and in and around poor neighborhoods. Food access, physical activity, neighborhood conditions, criminal justice, access to healthcare, social relationships, and community capacity. Those are all part of the social inequities, which and it's very layered and very complex. So we'll go to the next slide. And I purposely put this slide in, the next two slides in, because I wanted to give you the impact of COVID-19. COVID-19 is a pandemic, disproportionate and devastating harm to American Indian, Alaska Natives communities is a direct and damning consequence of the U.S. government's failure to uphold its legal, trust, and treaty obligations to Indian country. Currently, the Navajo Nation, which is the biggest circle that's red, has the highest infection rate of the country, which is greater than the worst hit state, which is New York. It is even greater than that of Wuhan at the height of the outbreak of China. Go to the next slide. And that's the most, whoops, uh-oh, I lost contact. Uh-oh. Hello? Jonathan?
We can hear you.
Okay, my screen is completely black. Okay, good. Okay. This is, as of June 16th, confirmed cases is over 10,000, and then total deaths is over 400. Now, this is only with the Indian health system. Now, all the community-based organizations are not included in that total. And then I put the source on the bottom, in the link in the bottom, in the blue link. Go to the next slide. And so Native people make up only around 1/10 of New Mexico's population, but more than 55% of its coronavirus cases. And in Wyoming, American Indian, Alaska Native people are less than 3% of the state population, but make up more than 1/3 of its cases. And this crisis and the underlying conditions that tribal communities face are the result of centuries of colonial violence and neglect that continue to this day. For example, the Navajo Nation, they don't even have running water. So they can't wash their hands. They have 3 clinics, and in one clinic, they only have 8 beds. So it's pretty devastating. Next slide. Oh yeah, you have it. At the root of all these vulnerabilities are the broken promises that the federal government made to tribes in the constitutional process of signing treaties to acquire their lands. And we'll go a little bit more into detail about the treaties. The tribes ceded huge swaths of land to the United States with the formal treaty enshrined understanding that the federal government would protect the tribes as sovereign political entities whose right to self-governance would safeguard and to whom it would provide adequate resources to deliver essential services. So what the treaties promised were protection for Indians from attacks upon their lands. And this also was supposed to include legal assistance from the government, healthcare, education, some money, sovereignty and religious freedom, and the confirmation and protection of certain rights like self-government, fishing and hunting rights, jurisdiction over their own lands. And then this is the foundation of the government-to-government relationship that exists between the federal government and tribal nations, which function not as a racial group, but as we're sovereign political entities to whom the United States has a recognized trust and treaty responsibility, which is embodied in the Constitution, treaties, and federal statutes. So it's actually the supreme law of the land. So, so the next slide. So for example, how the government is they've been violating the treaties. They have been not following it. They have been abrogating their policy decisions. They have been not sending the money that they've promised. Every single treaty that they've signed on to, have literally every single one has been broken. What is just IHS, Indian Health Services alone, need at least $9 billion to operate, and they've received maybe 9 million, so not 9 billion. And so, for example, they were not receiving like the test kits and the equipment like PPE, personal protection equipment, and they've bungled this emergency relief measures. For example, the Seattle Indian Health Board requested PPE, personal protection equipment, like gloves and masks and face coverings and smocks and that kind of thing. And what they sent instead, and they still haven't figured out who sent it, they sent body bags and not the PPE. And then in order to ally the current crisis, and in order for tribes to recover and prevent even more devastating recurrence, the U.S. government needs to address the systematic inequalities that have held Indian country back in its response to COVID-19, both as a matter of public safety and as one of legal and moral obligation. For example, during the CARES Act, they were supposed to submit $8 billion, and they have only submitted, they've only allocated 3.75 billion. And the number, I call him number 45, and his administration has actually withheld the money intentionally. So the next slide gives you what this report is recommending the US government take urgent action in 7 areas of high priority. And so to ensure the inclusion of American Indian Alaska Native people in the COVID-19 data, currently we're not included in the US, all of the data that they're reporting on the news, the Native Americans are not included in that data. Develop executive branch and infrastructure to address bureaucratic barriers. So we're not even at the executive branch level. Support and develop tribal economies. The only economies we have right now that we had to create on our own is through casinos, which we've all had to shut down. So we literally have no money coming in, and the money that we were using from the casinos was actually to help to build housing and to build infrastructure and to build healthcare system and healthcare buildings and clinics and that kind of thing, because the US government again said they were going to do it and never did it. And so we have the chronic underfunding, support and develop Indian countries' critical infrastructure, support vulnerable populations by funding tribal public safety and justice needs, which they also haven't done. So we've created our own tribal court system. All the tribes that are federally recognized have some sort of tribal court system within Washington state. And then to restore the tribal homelands and support tribal ecocultural resource management. And we'll go a little bit more into detail about that in the next couple of slides. Now, very briefly, I won't read all of these on each slide, but a couple of things have happened over the years since 1492, which is we consider actually the beginning of the end of our way of life. So, for example, there were violence between Indians and settlers increased over time. Disease was introduced by Europeans, which decimated Indian population by 100 million. And then the European population increased at an extremely greater rate. And then there began a pattern of invading Indian territory and taking possession. Next slide. And then from 1787 to 1828, they started to begin agreements between equals. And part of it was because Indian tribes, we had strong military and we were considered very much a threat. And so laws were passed to protect against the taking of Indian land. But few of the laws were actively enforced and expansion still was encouraged. Next slide. And then in 1828 to 1887, the government tried to relocate all of us. So they were removing Indian people from the eastern side and pushing them to the west. That was the dominant policy. And as the U.S. became stronger, they felt they didn't need to avoid the hostility with Indian tribes because they tried to kill us off either by guns and also by disease, very intentionally. And then they passed what they call the Indian Removal Act, or the IRA Act of 1830, which led to treaties that forced all the tribes out of the eastern side of the United States to the west. And then there was also the discovery of gold, which led to further expansion and slaughter of food source like bison. There's pictures of stacks and stacks of bison, dead bison, because they knew the Lakota and all the indigenous people in the plains utilized that as a food source. So they didn't want us to live. So they wanted to make sure we didn't have any food to survive. And so by 1887, there were over 200 boarding schools were established with 14,000 Indians forcibly enrolled. My father was actually sent to a boarding school in Washington State. So that still happened in our lifetime. So even though it started in 1887, it was practiced all the way until the 1960s. Also, the federal courts were authorized to prosecute Indians who committed certain crimes on the reservation, even though we were supposed to be sovereign nations within our own nation. And then also 1871, Congress passed laws that stopped additional treaties with Indian tribes. And the government no longer saw us as independent nations. Next slide. So the allotment and assimilation, so they were trying to force us into a white society was the new federal policy. So, and that's a big deal because in 1887, the General Allotment Act, which is called the Dawes Act, was sought to extinguish all of our tribal sovereignty, erase all of the reservation boundaries, and force assimilation. And they called it surplus land sold to non-Indians, which actually it was not surplus, it was actually stolen. Originally, all of the land was stolen through the doctrine of discovery, and you can learn more about that later, and that's in the resource sheet. And then the tribal culture was completely disrupted. So our communal life was destroyed, land was taken away again, and then outsiders were allowed to live on Indian reservations. It's what's called the checkerboard reservation. And then Congress allowed Indian land to be leased to non-Indians and controlled funds that resulted from the leases and determined when to distribute the funds. So the government was still trying to take control over all of us. And then in 1924, Congress passed a law that conferred US citizenship on Indians, whether they wanted it or not. Next slide. And then this is another important act that was passed by the government. In 1935, the Indian Reorganization Act, which is IRA, it's a federal Indian policy that changed this law, was enacted to protect the remaining Indian land base, which encouraged Indian tribes to adopt constitutions and engage in self-government. What the irony of this is that before contact, that's what we call before the white man came in 1492, we already had our own self-government. We already had our own constitution, our own way of being and living in a very communal way. And then the IRA was very and is very paternalistic, very ethnocentric, and extremely insufficient for operating. Next slide. And then 1953 to 1968 is what they call the termination era. And so the IRA goals were abandoned and federal policy changed again. So in order to terminate our federal government trust relationship with Indian tribes, that became the new policy, with the goal again to assimilate us. They're trying to again strip us more of our rights and our land, and whatever benefits were supposed to be allocated to us. They tried to eliminate all of our rights and services, which I listed earlier what the treaties were supposed to be providing. So in 1953, Public Law 280 gave 6 states criminal jurisdiction over Indian reservations. And that's a really big deal too, because we refer to Indian tribes as 238 tribes. And then, so certain tribes came under that public law and others did not. And then in 1956, the relocation program was trying to, they claimed they were offering job opportunity and housing assistance to Indians if they left the reservation to urban areas. But what they did is they gave them $20 and a bus ticket, bus ticket to, let's say, to Seattle, and that was it. And so that's the local programs here in Seattle were created by all Native American women and mothers and grandmothers. And then that would take a whole nother hour just to describe all of what's happening here locally. And then many tribal governments were disbanded and reservations abolished very intentionally. And that's, for example, the Duwamish land, the Duwamish tribe, were part of they were the very first signatories of the Point Elliott Treaty, which was signed in January 22nd of 1855. And that's when they lost their Indian, they were taken off of the treaty during that termination era. Next slide. In 1968 to the present time, that's called the Tribal Self-Determination, and that's where finally federal Indian policy started to change to one which actually promoted tribal sovereignty and self-determination. And since 1968, the legislative and executive branches have attempted to provide measures which would improve social and economic life of tribes and our people. However, since the 1970s, our interests, every time we've gone to Supreme Court, we've lost 80% of our cases because the Supreme Court is run by white men back then. Now it's just white men and one black man and 3 women. So we have not fared very well in with the Supreme Court or in with legal entities. Next slide. Now here's the map of Washington State tribes. The Duwamish tribe is, I don't know if you can see Tulalip, and then unfortunately it's not on the map, and that's because it's not a federally recognized tribe. This map is actually from, it's from Wikipedia, but there's also a map through the Governor Office of Indian Affairs, and the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs, the link is in the resource list. And I just want to make note that the Makah Nation is in the upper left-hand corner, the furthest north west of Washington State, and that's where Jeff Smith, he's Makah. My people are from Southeast Alaska, which is of course north of here. And Colville and Yakima are the 2 tribes that have the largest land base. But initially, the entire Washington State and the entire United States was all Indian land. So we'll go to the next slide. And I thought it was important also to include the differences between indigenous values and European values. And this is sort of a generic way. And this may not be true for each individual person, but this is more generic. The other thing I wanted to mention that European people or white people get to be seen as individuals, and Native people, Black people, Asian people, Hispanic, Latinx people, we only get to be seen as groups. And so if I do something, then my whole group gets judged based off if I do something. So there's a lot of pressure on all of us because we're being watched by the dominant group. So now the indigenous value is honoring our responsibilities, as opposed to the emphasis with European values more on rights and responsibilities, legal rights, etc. On the left, the indigenous, our focus is more on the group or the community. So when I make decisions, I think of my family, I think of the community. I think, in fact, if people ask me to make a decision, I can't make a decision right then and there. I have to say, I have to go back to the community and have a discussion. So it takes time. And then as opposed to as an individual. So European values, the value is with the individual person. And then on the indigenous value of all our relations, for example, all our relations include salmon, eagles, bison, and so like we have what we call like the insect nation, the tree nation, the plant nation. Those are all important. Those are all of our, so we're all related to each other, and they just have different ways of communicating. And so they're equally valuable to us. And for the European value is the non-humans are seen as resources, like trees are cut down without maybe even honoring them, or we would offer like tobacco and a prayer, and we would only cut them down after a certain time of season, after the sap has completely gone through the tree. Like when we make our cedar things for ourselves, our cedar hats and our clothing, we would only take a certain amount of cedar off of the tree so we wouldn't kill that tree. And then so in other words, what I just described was we're all interconnected, the circle of life, and that, so what happens to one group or one like if something happens to a tree, a salmon, another person, it affects all of us. And often Europeans are often disconnected from nature. I often remember walking and a person just wants to talk, and I want to look at the trees and the flowers and listen to the birds and see what the crows want to say and that kind of thing. And then we take only what we need and we give away. The idea is when our potlatches actually were outlawed by the US government, and we finally are coming back since 1990. And I participated in several potlatching, and the potlatching is a giveaway. It's different from a powwow. Potlatch is very different, similar but different. And where the European value is more accumulation of wealth. For example, my father's land, we're considered landless up in Alaska, the Wrangell city, the village of Wrangell, because the white people came, we call them the black robes, the Protestants came and said, oh, we like this village, so they took it. And they just ran over our people. They pushed us out. And then gold was discovered. And so then all the people came and then tore down trees and destroyed a lot of the land just to get to the gold. And then we have the natural law versus the man law, and then respect for elders and youth, where as opposed to the obsession of youth. Everything is about youth on television and the ads, and you're not supposed to look old. And you know, when I start looking old, then I start getting ignored and pushed aside. So let's go to the next slide. And then this is the part I thought you would be very interested in, because this directly relates to the work that you're all doing, which is fabulous. I want to say that I'm very proud and very honored to be part of this group. I really believe that decriminalizing these plant medicine is what I call them, because they're good for us, they're healthy for us. And pre-contact with the European, we utilized all of the plants in different ways. Peyote, for example, hemp, marijuana, all of those things, and also even tobacco. But what we didn't add like bad things, you know, like chemicals to tobacco. We use it for ceremony and that kind of thing. So the American Indian Religious Freedom Act originally was passed in 1978 and was amended in 1994. And it was amended to provide that the use, possession, or transportation of peyote by an Indian for bona fide traditional ceremonial purposes in connection with the practice of traditional Indian religion as lawful and shall not be prohibited by the United States or by any state. And then it also went on to allow governments to enforce specific prohibitions against ingesting such drugs by like an on-duty officer and officials and members of the military. Congress adopted the law after the Supreme Court issued decisions that failed to protect sacramental drug use, and that's why it was amended. So we'll go to the next slide. This, I thought you might be interested in this picture. It's actually a picture from 1892 of an actual peyote ceremony. And so this directly relates to the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. And this is actually on their land, a traditional native land. Next page, next slide. And then So I'm sorry, go to the next slide. Okay, so now the reason I included this slide is in 1978, that was the original act that was passed. And part of the reason why they had to do that is because, and they had to list American Indian, Eskimo, Aleut, Native Hawaiians, and that it was not limited to access to sites, but limited to access to sites used in possession of sacred objects and the freedom to worship through ceremony and traditional rites. Now, this is just a small portion of that act. It's more lengthy. And I included the link to the Indian Religious Freedom Act in the what do you call that? The section for resources. So the next slide. Now, there's some challenges. Of course, as you know, the way federal courts and the way the government works is they are always trying to either eliminate our rights, or they're forgetting, for example, the construction of dams that actually flooded our Native American holy sites. They also flooded, like when they built a dam, it eliminated the access to salmon, for example. And so there were certain laws and certain times that we actually had to go back to court. We're always having to go back to court to continue to fight for our rights and to it, because, for example, these acts, often lacked enforcement mechanisms. Go to the next slide. So so I included this particular Employment Division, Department of Human Resources of Oregon versus Smith, because the court ruled that a state was not compelled to exempt the sacramental use of peyote by Native Americans because the drug laws in questions were general laws and not ones aimed at particular religious adherents. And so there was a stronger act that passed to protect First Amendment religious freedom, which is citing its power under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment to enforce equal protection. So Congress responded to the Smith decision by adopting the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. And so it sought to require courts to apply a compelling interest test before justifying restrictions on religious exercise. So go to the next slide. Okay, go to the next slide. Sorry, that is a duplicate. Okay. Okay, the reason I mention this, if you go to the Religious Land Use Institutionalized Persons Act of 2000, which applies specifically to federal property, conflicts and accommodations are likely to continue in this area in the near future. And so there are holes in this Freedom Act. And I'm mentioning this because it's not set in concrete, and there's issues that, so we're always, again, having to hire attorneys to help defend the act, and having to continually update and upgrade the act or amend. And I've also listed the person who wrote the article. Let's go to the next slide. Now, I'll very briefly go over the oil spills. And the reason why I mention this is because the oil spills are very harmful to the water. The water initially here, pre-contact, was so pristine and so full of salmon. And remember, salmon is our lifeblood, is the way how we feed ourselves. And then the salmon, dies and then fertilizes the land. And then also bears and all the other livestock actually eat the salmon, including eagles, and then whatever the salmon ingests, we ingest. And so also the oil spills have added the such huge devastation to the land, to the water, to the and livelihood of indigenous people and non-indigenous people, and also has actually seeped into the water table. And that's where we get our drinking water. For example, that's why the Navajos have no drinking water as well, and across the entire United States. And these two are particularly with the Swinomish. I picked a couple that were in Washington State. So I'll go to the next slide. And then this shows you the largest oil spills affecting the US waters, and also the different years and the different areas. So there's been huge oil spills affecting US waters, which also affect the plant life. And so, as you know, when we plant, when the plants are actually drinking the water that's also polluted, then the plants are polluted. And we want to make sure that we're not ingesting plants that harm us. So we'll go to the next slide. And then here is important. Here's the part that how to be an ally, or often is referred to as a co-conspirator. And what we mean by co-conspirator is not like in a criminal sense, but a co-conspirator is in terms of an ally that's actually taking action. So it's important to respect and support indigenous sovereignty, learn about treaties. Treaties are the supreme law of the land. It's also in articles in the US Constitution. Please consider future generations in all your decisions, and we like to plan for 7 generations from now. And then also question and resist stereotypes, including team names and mascots. We're trying to end utilizing, we want the Washington Redskins to completely change their name. For example, we've been fighting for that for many, many years. And then please learn more and reject the doctrine of discovery. And that's some of the information is also in the resource sheet. We want you to take the time to slow down and listen more than you talk, for example. Please work to end global warming, support renewable energy, stop hydrofracking, dirty coal and uranium mining. And connected to that is divest from banks that are actually supporting the large corporations that are actually building the oil and doing the fracking and doing and building the uranium mines. And then please do not co-opt Native culture and ceremonies. Next slide. And then it's also required now to return sacred remains and objects. That's part of Public Law 101-601, which has to do with the Graves Act. And then purchase only authentic Native American art and products, which is part of Public Law 101-644, and that's actually nationwide. And then please read and promote the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's actually quite a lengthy and detailed document, which I have a copy of. We celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, October 12th, as opposed to Columbus Day. And luckily, the city of Seattle has passed that as well. And then learn about Indigenous peoples' land, like, for example, the land you're living and working on. And you have a map so you can learn more about how to do that. And then all beings, plants and animals are all our relatives and not resources. Please appreciate the diversity of nations, cultures, and people. There's over 573 tribes that are federally recognized and a lot of others that are not federally recognized. And that's because the government chose to pretend that they didn't exist. And then please read Native authors, support Native people, businesses, and events. And the picture of that is actually a picture of my traditional ceremonial robe. It's also called a button blanket. It's a cleaned up button blanket, and it's a picture of my button blanket, which is over 30 years old. Next slide. And then this is just an equity resource list of the people like Sherry Brown. She's the founder of National Coalition Building Institute. She's out of Silver Springs, Maryland. That's why I received a great deal of training for over 2 years, very intensive, extensive training on how to give workshops and how to be allies to all the different races um, for over 2 years on how to undo institutionalized racism. Glenn Harris is the president of Race Forward, previously known as Center for Social Inclusion. I was very active within the group of that worked with Glenn Harris for the last 3 years. Dr. Robin DeAngelo, she lives locally. She's a lecturer for University of Washington. She and I worked together at the city of Seattle. She previously served as the Director of Inclusion and Equity with Sound Generations. And she has a couple of she has a website, and also I listed a couple of really interesting YouTube presentations that she's given over the years, like at Shoreline Community College. And then I'm also in the book, go back to one slide, What Does It Mean to Be White? I'm in, help write chapter 15 in that book. Next slide. And then I listed some nonprofit agencies and some good data. I did list the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs. Their link, they have wonderful resources. UIHI is the Urban Indian Health Institute, and they are connected to the Seattle Indian Health Board, and they have some really good data. And it also includes the Bolt decision about that was having to do with the fishing decision. And that has to do with Northwest Indian Fishing Commission. And then the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, Public Law 95341, which I mentioned earlier, that resource is there. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is Public Law 101601, that link is in there. Next page, next slide. And then, of course, there were some really good articles on COVID-19 response in Indian country. And then some really good information about, there was a 14,000-year-old village that was unearthed in British Columbia Islands by University of Victoria student. And then there's some really good resource on mindful listening article, and then Indigenous knowledge systems with an Alaska Native way of knowing. And the resources list, what I'd like to do is we can send those to you through Leo. Next page. And then also the movie Doctrine of Discovery, Unmasking the Domination Code is an excellent movie. It's only 61 minutes. It was released in 2015. I've watched it numerous times, and it gives you really good data and information of what I just gave you about the Doctrine of Discovery. It talks about the Papal, about why they claimed domination over the land, and why they named the natives as heathens, and they didn't consider us even human beings. At least Black people, even though there were slaves, they were at least 3/5 of human, and we natives were not even seen as human. And then the Indian Arts and Crafts Act of 1990, Public Law 101644, that link is in there as well. So we'll go to the next sheet. These are the treaties that are in Washington State, and all the wording of all the treaties is in the Governor's Office for Indian Affairs. And the treaties of the Medicine, that's the Treaty of Medicine Creek, was from 1854. And that has to do with the Duwamish, the Nisqually, the Puyallup, the Squaxin Island, and Muckleshoot. The Treaty of Point Elliott of 1855 also includes the Duwamish, or it used to, the Lummi, the Nooksack, the Stillaguamish, the Swinomish, the Upper Skagit, the Suquamish, the Soxhawtla, the Tulalip, and Muckleshoot. The Treaty of Point No Point of 1855 has to do with the Jamestown Sklallam, Port Gamble Sklallam, Lower Elwha, and the Skokomish. And then the Treaty of Nia Bay is with the Nia Bay people. The treaty with the Yakima has to do with Yakima. And if you notice, Yakima is spelled Y-A-K-A-M-A. The Native people, that's how they spell their name. And that's of 1855. And then the Quinault Treaty, those are the folks that are south of us. That's with the Quinault Nation of 1856. And then the treaty with the Walla Walla Nation of 1855. And that individual, she was part of the canoe journey that happened last year. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, this is the part that we're going to, these are the 3 questions. We're going to break you up into small groups and through Zoom groups. And these are the 3 questions that'll be on the screen. And then the slides after this is the Ally Bill of Responsibilities, which there are 16 of them. And we'll break you out and we'll give you at least 20 minutes, if not longer. And Jonathan will break the folks out. Is there anything that you'd like to say, Jonathan, about the Ally Bill of Responsibilities or anything before we break out into small groups?
Jonathan, you're muted.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, there we go.
Yes. Okay, so you've taken in a lot of information here. We are hoping that the points that we're making about the characteristics of a good ally, we hope that they will kind of counter the effect of all the negative things that you've seen in the information that we provided you. We hope that you will, we'll start the groups and you'll take like 2, 3, 4 minutes to reflect on what you've seen and then try to answer those questions.
And also to read. There's quite a bit to read also with the Ally Bill of.
Right. So should we go? So we'll go ahead and go through the Ally Bill of Rights. And
Yes.
so does everybody understand what we're doing?
Yeah, is it possible that we could take a quick 2-minute break? I really need a pee.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we'll pause the recording. Here we go.
You want me to read the questions?
Just a sec. Okay. Here are the questions one more time.
Okay.
Which would be the most challenging personally? Which do you think you can implement? Where do you think you need more information and or training? So here we go. Come on. There we go. So number 1, do not act out of guilt, but rather out of a genuine interest in challenging the larger oppressive power structures. 2, allies understand that they are secondary to the indigenous people that they're working with and that they seek to serve. They and their needs must take a back seat. That does not mean that they'll be ignored. It just means that they're not the first priority. Whoops, sorry. 3, are fully grounded in their own ancestral history and culture. Effective allies must sit with this knowledge with confidence and pride. Otherwise, the wannabe syndrome could merely undermine the indigenous people's efforts. 4, are aware of their privileges and openly discuss them. This action will also serve to challenge larger oppressive power structures. 5, reflect on and embrace their ignorance of the group's oppression and always hold this ignorance in the forefront of their minds. Otherwise, a lack of awareness of their ignorance could merely perpetuate the indigenous people's oppression. 6, are aware of and understand the larger oppressive power structures that serve to hold certain groups and people down. One way to do this is to draw parallels through critically reflecting on their own experiences with oppressive power structures. Reflecting on their subjectivity in this way, they ensure critical thought, or what others call objectivity. In taking this approach, these parallels will serve to ensure that non-Indigenous allies are not perpetuating the oppression. 7, allies constantly listen and reflect through the medium of subjectivity, that means how you feel about things, and critical thought versus merely their subjectivity. This will serve to ensure that they avoid the trap that they or their personal friends know what is best. This act will also serve to avoid the trap of naively following a leader, or for that matter, a group of leaders. 8. Strive to remain critical thinkers and seek out the knowledge and wisdom of the critical thinkers in the group. Allies cannot assume that all people are critical thinkers and have a good understanding of the larger power structures of oppression. 9. Ensure that a community consensus or understanding has been established in terms of their role as allies. That is, an understanding with the people you're working with. Otherwise, the efforts of the people will be undermined due to a lack of consultation and agreement. 10. Ensure that the needs of the most oppressed, women, children, elderly, young teenage girls and boys, and the disabled, that is, people with disabilities, are served in the effort or movement that they are supporting. Otherwise, they may be engaging in a process that is inadequate and thus merely serving to fortify the larger power structures of oppression. Alternatively, their good intentions may not serve those who need the effort most. Rather, they may be making the oppression worse. 11. Understand and reflect on the prevalence and dynamics of lateral oppression and horizontal violence on and within oppressed groups and components of the group, such as women, and seek to ensure that their actions do not encourage it. 12. Ensure that they are supporting a leader's, group of leaders, or a movement's efforts that serve the needs of the people. For example, do the community people find this leader's efforts useful, interesting, engaging, and thus empowering? If not, allies should consider whether the efforts are moving in a questionable or possibly an inadequate direction, or worse yet, that their efforts are being manipulated and thus undermined, possibly for economic and political reasons. 13. Understand that sometimes allies are merely manipulatively chosen to further a leader's agenda versus the indigenous nations, communities, or organizations' concerns, and when this situation occurs, act accordingly. 14. Do not take up the space and resources, physical and financial, of the oppressed group. 15. Do not take up time at community meetings and community events. This is not their place. They must listen more than speak. Allies cannot perceive all the larger oppressive power structures as clearly as members of the oppressive group can. And finally, 16, accept the responsibility of learning and reading more about their role as effective allies. And then Gunal Chish means thank you. So I'm going to go back to the slide with the questions again. There they are. So which of these would be most challenging personally? Which do you think you can implement, giving brief details, and where do you think you need more information and or training? So again, I'm going to stop the share, pause the recording.